Located in the southern hemisphere, sharing with South Africa many features as its climate, we find Australia, a country, a continent, an island. High Commissioner Mcarthy, thank you so much to be today with us at Embassy Direct. Excellency, as the Australian High Commissioner, accredited to 7 countries in Southern Africa, including Angola, Botswana, Lesotho, Mozambique, Namibia, South Africa, Swaziland, as well as to the Southern Africa Development Community. How would you define your diplomatic tour in the region this far? Are there any moments or events that have stood out for you?
Well, thank you very much, Rodrigo. And I should say you didn't have to completely correct yourself then. I am indeed Ambassador to Angola and High Commissioner to the other 6. It's an interesting background. A lot of people ask where the term High Commissioner comes from. And it came from the original idea that back in the old British Commonwealth that we couldn't be ambassadors when we had the same head of state, i.e. being the King or Queen of England. So that's where the term High Commissioner came from originally. But I am indeed both. Certainly High Commissioner here though. And look, there's been so many wonderful moments. I mean, a couple spring to mind. We had Gareth Evans, our former Foreign Minister, here to receive the Order of Oliver Tambo in December 2015 for his contribution to the anti-apartheid movement. And we had lunch with Cyril Ramaphosa, the Deputy President. We also met with former President de Klerk. We met the current President, had at a roundtable lunch with him. And it was tremendous to see the Australian contribution to the anti-apartheid movement being honoured in that fashion. Some of the moments that have been most enjoyable have actually involved high schools that we work with in various capacities. We've got a terrific ongoing relationship with Moletsani High School in Soweto, and going out there for assemblies, for various events that they've held, seeing the enthusiasm of the children has been something truly remarkable. I'd also have to say the work that we've done with the Tutu Desk Foundation, and again, going out to high schools in rural Northwest Province and in rural Limpopo, and seeing the looks on children's faces when they receive their Tutu desks is really something quite remarkable as well. Smile Foundation, a charity that does facial reconstructive surgery, cleft lip palates and so on, that we support for our direct aid program. I was lucky enough to have gone out a couple of times to see and talk to various children who've received surgery life-changing surgery by virtue of the work that Smile does. So it's those little things that I find, tremendously valuable in the job, as well as, of course, the high-level meetings and everything else.
Being in South Africa, you must feel as at home. How have you and your family adapted to living in South Africa? Have you enjoyed the experience of it within your job and your personal life?
Oh, absolutely. It's a magnificent country. And in fact, I remain of the view that tourism here should be perhaps even more so, an incredible driver for the economy. It's like Australia, it's incredibly varied. And I think one of the things that we will take out will just be the holidays and the variety of holidays. We've been lucky enough to drive over a reasonable proportion of this country now, and we've done some of the obvious places, but also some of the less obvious places. All the time being on the road here is an absolute pleasure. A bit like home, you get big vistas, big open blue sky, long views that pan out in front of you, and then beautiful beaches, beautiful jungles. Of course, the safaris is something. We have unique wildlife in Australia, and there is certainly unique wildlife here. In terms of the education and in terms of the health services, my daughter has some medical issues. We've found both to be excellent. And I think more than anything else, and this is the intangible, Rodrigo, we've enjoyed the vibrancy of life here. You always know you're alive living in South Africa. There's always colour and movement and tremendous variety. So yeah, we're very happy here. We're having a thoroughly enjoyable time.
That's great. South Africa and Australia share a long history of diplomacy together, having established diplomatic relations in 1947, and this year celebrating 70 years of cooperation. How would you describe the relationship between both countries? What are the areas of strengths together, and where can relations, in your opinion, come to an improvement?
It's an interesting question. And in fact, when you look at that history, I'd actually take it a step forward from the establishment of diplomatic relations and a step back as well. Australians first fought as Australians in an overseas war in the Boer War. It's not a terribly well-known fact, but we served on the British side. But the first Australians, because we federated in 1900, the first Australians to fight under an Australian flag did so here in South Africa. You're right about the diplomatic relations being established 70 years ago, but we really take the starting point of our modern relationship with Australia, of course, is 1994. It was obviously a fractious and difficult relationship during the apartheid years. We were one of the leaders in the anti-apartheid movement globally. We supported sanctions very strongly. We banned sporting teams selected on the basis of race from 1971. So for the first part of the diplomatic relationship, I think it's fair to say it was strained. But from 1994 onwards, we've of course enjoyed a close relationship with a democratic South Africa, a country that we're proud, along with a number of others, to have played a part in the creation of.
Australia was fervently vocal about its opposition, as you said, to apartheid era in South Africa, having supporting the UN resolutions against apartheid and implementing embargoes and boycotts against South Africa. In what way do you think such international action can positively affect the governance of a country, and how important do you think similar international watchdogging is in today's age?
I think a balance always has to be struck. We have to respect each country's right to govern itself, but also there are certain fundamental values that we always need as an international community to speak out in support of. And of course, non-racialism is one of the most essential of all. The fact that we are all the same regardless of the colour of our skin is in one sense the most obvious point to anyone. It's the most obvious point of humanity, and yet it's still a value that's not respected in some parts of the world. I think it's also important that we be vocal as an international community in the defence of democracy. There are certain, to avoid arbitrary replacement of democratic government by, for instance, military action, there are certain fundamental principles that the international community should remain seized of and active of, while also respecting each country's right to be in charge of and responsible for its own affairs. And obviously there will always be a role for the international community in terms of the peaceful resolution of disputes. And that is something that Australia has been involved with globally. We've also been very heavily involved within our own region, from the Cambodian peace process onwards, including the Bougainville peace process and the Ramsey deployment to the Solomon Islands. It's something that we've been active on within our region, but I think there's always a role for the international community in terms of peacefully resolving disputes. So like most things in life, it's a balancing act, but it's important where those fundamental values, like the fact that we are all equal regardless of race, get breached, then it's important that the international community speak.
In that same breath, now that you mentioned about your collaboration in developing democracies, Australia was an important role player in helping this country to adapt since 1994 to a new system of democracy. It is reported that Australian aid provides assistance to South Africa to achieve goals set out in its reconstruction and development program and its growth, employment and redistribution macroeconomic strategy. Could you elaborate on these 8 schemes and the way in which the two countries work together for positive, proactive and progressive growth?
Absolutely, Rodrigo. Although, just before I get into that, I would take it one step. In terms of our contribution to a democratic South Africa, it even goes one step further than that. In the CODESA period, senior ANC politicians, several of whom I've spoken to, and others involved in the CODESA project, went to Australia to study our constitution, issues like the division of powers between the states and the federation, the way our constitution was set up, and there are some senior figures, for instance, within the ANC who I've had conversations with and will happily say this provision of the South African constitution or this way of doing things is modelled on how it's done in Australia. Now, of course, they were collecting the best practice from all sorts of countries, but we were one of the ones that they looked to for examples and precedents on certain issues. In terms of our development program, we have a number of ways in which we seek to contribute in South Africa. Most importantly, we have our Australia Awards program. This is a scholarships program where we take people for masters and short course awards to Australia, focusing on areas where we feel we've got a contribution to make, especially in agriculture and things like sustainable water management. As you mentioned at the outset, Rodrigo, we're the driest continent in the world. I'm very fond of saying that we don't have the same drought problem as Southern Africa. We have the same droughts. We have the same El Nino cycle, which means that when Australia is in drought, it is at the same time as Southern Africa is in drought. It's exactly the same climatic pattern that gives us a drought and gives Southern Africa a drought. Public financial management, extractives are obviously all areas where we can make a contribution to building skills here through the Australia Awards. We also have what we call our Australian Volunteers for International Development program, where we bring Australians with relevant skills to contribute in all sorts of many and varied ways here. You know, we've had physiotherapists working with disabled children. We've had people whose background is in accountancy, helping to financially manage important NGOs in this country. We've got a person now with Sonke Gender Justice who's working on a major study into prostitution in South Africa. They make all sorts of different and varied contributions. We then have what we call our direct aid program. And you may remember I mentioned earlier on the Tutu Desk Foundation and the Smile Foundation. We make contributions to those organisations through direct aid. It is a program that we have, if you like, within the post, and it enables us to make grants to various organisations on a relatively small scale, about 600,000 rand more or less. But 600,000 rand to an organisation can do a lot of good here in South Africa. And then we have other agencies. The Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, for instance, does a lot of work on sustainable water management here in South Africa and drought-resistant crops and the like. So we'll never be one of the biggest donors here, but what we seek to do is take those areas where we have skills that are particularly relevant to South Africa. As I said, dry land farming and agriculture, best practice in terms of mining. You know, we ran a safe mine closures course recently that emphasised that when you establish a mine, you need to have a plan for closing it at the time you open it. We've got world-class standards in mining in terms of things like occupational health and safety and also environmental remediation. So passing on those skills is something we put a great value on here. So it's really about human capacity building and passing on those skills. And again, it's an area where we're very delighted, very pleased to be able to make a contribution.
Australian exports to South Africa amount to over 2.5 billion Australian dollars.
Correct.
And imports about 1.3 billion Australian dollars. Could you elaborate on the economic and commercial bilateral relations that these countries share? Is there a strong presence of South African corporate business in Australia and vice versa?
Absolutely. I think historically the relationship very much focused around extractives because we're both resource-rich countries. And so South African companies wanted to invest in Australia and Australian companies wanted to invest in South Africa. One of the pleasing things we've seen recently is the growth in the retail and services fields, going in both directions. The Australian retailer Cotton On, for instance, the South African market is the number one driver of growth in their global business. 3 of their top 10 stores in the world are here in South Africa, and they fully expect that their largest store globally, which is in the Mall of Africa, will make it 4 out of the top 10. The Mcarthy family have been doing our little bit to help them on their way. We shop there regularly. But also, we've got Australian telecommunications providers, Australian banks, a range of Australian companies see opportunities in this market. Going in the other way, of course, one of our major retailers, David Jones, was bought by Woolworths South Africa not so long ago. There's been a long history of South African investment in Australia. Mr. Price opened up quite recently in Australia, and you tend to find, particularly in the retail sphere, because of the cultural similarities and the climatic similarities, what goes well in Australia tends to go well in South Africa and vice versa. So that growth in the retail area is something that is, and investment is something that is really pleasing. I always say that we both tend to look northwards as countries. We look north to Asia and you look north to the rest of Africa. And maybe at times it means we miss opportunities that are there. We have the same language. We have a lot of cultural similarities. We have the same sense of humour, by and large. All of these things mean that, for instance, an advertising campaign that has worked in South Africa will probably work in Australia and vice versa. The common seasonality, for reasons that are pretty complicated, can really work in terms of helping retail businesses in both directions. The fact that if you're sourcing your summer stock in South Africa, you're sourcing it at the same time for Australia means that companies can do very well. There's efficiencies in that as well. So there's all sorts of reasons to suggest that while we're doing well in a business sense, there's still room to do even better still.
That's good. So what would you say attracts these Australian companies to come to South Africa to invest? Is there a present an Australian South African Chamber of Commerce, or from your mission, is there a commercial attaché looking into these topics?
Both. So we have the Australia South Africa Business Chamber that is headquartered in Johannesburg and is a strong and growing group. In fact, I'm attending a breakfast that they're hosting for the Mayor of Johannesburg on Friday, actually. But they are becoming more and more active. They've got a larger membership base. They were only established a couple of years ago, but they are growing. In addition, the trade promotion responsibility for Australia rests with an organisation called Austrade, and they have their African headquarters in Sandton, basically. So we have a senior trade commissioner, a person called Kim Fulgrave, who's responsible for promoting the commercial relationship between the two countries. Further to that, we have a first secretary in the embassy, David Eggleston, who's responsible for what we call economic diplomacy, the business-to-business relationships, and also seizing those opportunities. In terms of what Australian companies see in South Africa, they see a very well-run and regulated stock market. They see a robust judiciary. They know, hopefully, when they enter into contracts, they'll go well, but if needs be, there's a strong and independent judiciary and they can have a fair hearing in a South African court. They see very similar structures in terms of the regulation of corporate law and how companies operate. And as I said, common language, a lot of common reference points culturally, all of those things help, basically, as well.
Good. So now we're going to loosen our ties and probably grab a can of Foster beer.
Yes.
And we're going to head to the sport field.
Excellent.
Tell me, Adam, and as is well known, South Africa and Australia share a friendly rivalry on the sports field. Not only in rugby, but in cricket, swimming, and even motorsport too. How important do you think sport is in bringing countries together?
It's a tremendous common reference point. It's obviously being able to talk rugby, cricket in particular, netball, swimming, soccer. I mean, football's the biggest participation sport in both countries. We, of course, were one of the finalists when South Africa hosted the World Cup in 2010. Correct. Being able to talk football is something that's very important as well. I can go to a Mamelodi Sundowns match or a Blue Bulls match or a Rand Slam match and, well, know very much what's going on and be able to talk to all of the people around me about that. Netball match I was at, my last Australia-South Africa event was the netball test in February. And again, this is a sport that is part of the glue that binds us together. And we're both, I think, sporting-wise, we're pretty similar countries. We both sort of like to win. We both play hard, but out of a love and passion for sport. South Africans just don't seem to like Shane Warne as much as we do, that's all. But apart from that, that's fine. No, it's a tremendous linking factor in the relationship. And I can talk to anyone in this country about sport and there'll be some very common reference points.
That's great. Finally, and still with sport, Australia is at the top of many of the world rankings at the moment. What's the secret to success, would you say?
Well, I think the question, Rodrigo, is pretty generous. I don't know whether we're at the top at the moment. Certainly, South Africa recently put us to the sword in the Test series. We are 1-1 with India, and let's just see how I'm feeling about that series in 2 weeks' time. We have a good outdoors climate for sport. We have a sporting culture. But I think the key thing always with success in sport is there's nothing like participation. You can't tend to magically manufacture a sporting elite through investment at the top. You have to have numbers feeding in at the bottom. And we, like South Africa, have an excellent sporting culture. You drive around any town on on a Saturday morning, there'll be girls playing netball, boys playing rugby and cricket, both boys and girls playing school soccer. We've got, in terms of mass participation sports, Australia has cricket, Australian rules football, of course, rugby league, rugby union, football, which, as I said, is the largest of the lot, netball. We've got so many big sports, and of course, again, like South Africa, we've got spaces. We've got a lot of golf courses, a lot of tennis courts, and a climate that's pretty conducive to being able to play all of those sports. So it also requires support from governments and corporations and everyone else. But I just think a sporting culture and large numbers of people participating is an integral starting point to everything. I still play tennis 3 times a week. Australians tend to stay at their sports a bit like South Africans through life, which is one of the really pleasing things about it. So it is a great commonality between us. It is a great connecting point between us, and long may it stay that way.
Thanks. With this, we end this very interesting interview to High Commissioner Adam Mcarthy from the Commonwealth of Australia. Thank you so much,
Thank
Adam,
you
for
very
your
much,
time today, and I hope to see you around.
An absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Thanks, Rodrigo.